Christmas used to smell like cinnamon and pine. Maria would hum carols while basting the turkey, and I'd carve little wooden stars for the tree. Back then, the house felt alive, laughter in every corner, warmth even in the draft. Now it's just me and the clock ticking too loud. I was sanding a piece of oak for the neighbor's porch when the snow began to fall, big, soft flakes like the ones Maria loved. I thought maybe this year I'll bring the old recipe for stuffing to Daniel's house. He always said it reminded him of home. So I called him. "Hey, son, I've made the turkey stuffing. Thought I'd drop by early, help you set the table." A pause, long enough to feel wrong. Then he said quietly, "You're not invited this Christmas." I waited for a laugh. There wasn't one. Just silence and the faint echo of my own breath. I asked if Victoria's family was coming again. Maybe it was crowded. But he said, "It's better this way, Dad. Please understand. Understand." How do you understand being erased from your own family's table, from a house you helped pay for, from memories you built with your bare hands? The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, still smelling the nutmeg on my sleeve, like a ghost who didn't realize he'd died. I looked at the small box on the counter, a toy truck for my grandson. Still wrapped, still waiting. They say Christmas is about forgiveness, but what if the people you love the most won't even let you in? If you've ever been turned away by the ones you die for, this story might hurt to hear. Don't look away. I stepped outside the cold, biting through my coat. Across the street, lights flickered in other homes, children laughing, music spilling through cracked windows. Every sound felt borrowed, every joy someone else's. For the first time in 70 years, I realized Christmas had moved on without me. I've never been good at sitting still. Even after retiring, I kept the old workshop behind the house. A man spends 40 years with his hands shaping wood. He doesn't just stop. So I fixed chairs for neighbors, carved toys for their kids, anything to fill the silence Maria left behind. The house creaks when the wind comes down from the mountains. It's small, but it's mine. The walls still smell like cedar and varnish. On the mantel, there's a photo of Daniel when he was 10, holding the first birdhouse we built together. He used to brag about it to his schoolmates, how his dad could make anything from nothing. I used to think that pride would last forever. Daniel grew up smart, ambitious. He got a scholarship to Oregon State, then a job in Portland with a tech firm. When he met Victoria Carter, everything in his life suddenly glittered. Her family owned 3 vacation homes and a vineyard in Salem. She had that polished kind of beauty that photographs love, every hair in place, voice soft but sharp. I was happy for him, proud even. When they bought their house, a big glass-fronted place with a white porch and stone pillars, I helped them pay the down payment, $50,000 from the savings Maria and I had built over a lifetime of work. Later, when the mortgage interest spiked, I covered the next 5 years of payments. I told myself it was temporary, a father helping his son find his feet. But somehow, Daniel never stopped needing that help. I built their dining table from scratch, oak planks with a dark walnut finish, the kind that lasts longer than most marriages. Victoria didn't thank me. She only asked if I could make it look less rustic. So I sanded away the last bit of my pride and stained it again until it gleamed. She called it modern after that. They invited me often at first, then less, then only on holidays. The last time I went down to Portland before Maria died, I remember standing on their porch with a pumpkin pie. Victoria opened the door, her smile tight. "Daniel's friends might drop by later," she said. "Maybe you can visit next weekend instead." "Hayes." "Sure, sweetheart," I said, even though she'd stopped calling me Dad months ago. I handed her the pie. She took it with 2 fingers, like it might stain her manicure. Daniel came to the door behind her, looking tired but grateful. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. Then the door closed, soft but final. That's how it started, the small, polite ways a family uninvites you from your own life. After Maria passed, the house grew quieter. I thought keeping the Christmas tradition alive might hold what was left of us together. Every December I cooked her recipe roast turkey with orange zest, cornbread stuffing, and spiced cranberry glaze. I'd drive down to Portland, knock on their door with a smile, pretending I hadn't noticed the awkward silences. This year, after Daniel said, "You're not invited," I told myself it must be a misunderstanding. Maybe Victoria's parents were visiting. Maybe there wasn't enough space. I wanted to believe that. So 2 days later, I loaded the car anyway, just in case he changed his mind. The road from Spokane to Portland is long but familiar. I've driven it 100 times past frozen rivers and pines dusted white. I stopped once to refill gas and buy hot coffee. The clerk wished me Merry Christmas. I tried to return the smile. By the time I reached their neighborhood, dusk had fallen. Every house glowed with gold and red lights, laughter spilling through the frosted windows. When I pulled up to Daniel's driveway, I could see silhouettes moving inside the shape of Victoria, arranging flowers, the sparkle of a chandelier I'd helped pay for. I sat there for a while, the car engine humming softly. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Please go home, Dad. Victoria's family is here. We'll call you after the holidays." I stared at the screen, snow tapping against the windshield like it wanted to say something. The turkey sat in the cooler beside me, still warm from the oven. I thought about walking up, knocking anyway. But I didn't want to make a scene, not on Christmas Eve. I backed the car out slowly, headlights cutting across the lawn I'd mowed last spring. Through the window, I saw Victoria's father lift a glass of wine, Daniel laughing beside him. For a moment, I almost believed they didn't see me at all. The highway was empty on the way back. The radio played "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." Sinatra's voice cracked on the word "faithful," and I laughed under my breath. Faithful, funny word, isn't it? The snow thickened, swallowing the road ahead. I turned off the radio. The only sound left was the wipers scraping away what kept coming back. Sometimes the cruelest distance isn't measured in miles, it's in how quietly a door closes. When I got home, the house felt smaller than ever. I left the turkey on the counter and sat by the window, watching the snow fill the yard. Across the street, my neighbor's kids were building a snowman, laughing so hard their scarves came loose. I used to think laughter carried warmth through walls. Turns out silence travels faster. I checked my phone again. No new messages, just the same text from Daniel. I typed a few words. "Drive safe, love you son," then deleted them. Some things sound desperate once you see them written down. In the corner of the room, Maria's armchair waited untouched since the day she left. I could almost hear her voice telling me not to take it personally. She'd always known how to keep peace, even when it hurt. Once, years ago, she'd said, "Robert, love them enough to let them forget you for a while. They'll come back when the world turns quiet." I waited for the world to turn quiet. It never did. When she passed, I set up a small bank transfer to Daniel every month, enough to cover his mortgage and a few extras. He never asked for it, but he never refused it either. I told myself it was what Maria would have wanted, but lately I wasn't so sure. Maybe I'd taught him that love meant never letting him struggle. Maybe that was the real mistake. The heater clicked off, and the air went still. I took the old ledger from the drawer, flipping through the carbon copies of every payment, mortgage, drafts, checks for furniture, even the tuition fund I'd started for my grandson. I wasn't keeping score, but the numbers were starting to feel like gravestones. Each one marked another year I'd traded pride for proximity. The lights outside dimmed under the snowstorm. The town was already shutting down for Christmas Eve. I stood up, made myself a cup of instant coffee, and turned on the porch light, though no one was coming. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't comfort, it accuses. The kind that asks, was it worth it? I thought about calling Daniel again, but I didn't want to hear his voice sound like pity. Instead, I sat at the table I'd built for Maria and whispered a toast into the empty room. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I said. "Looks like it's just us again." Outside, the wind howled like someone trying to come home. There's a smell that takes me back, sawdust and rain. It was the scent of my youth, of the life Maria and I built with our bare hands. We were 23 when we got married, living in a rented room above a bakery. I worked as a carpenter's apprentice, and she taught at a small kindergarten across town. We didn't have much, but every night she came home with chalk on her fingers and a smile that could light the room better than any lamp. We saved every dollar. When we finally bought a small plot of land outside Spokane, Maria stood there in the mud with her arms crossed and said, "This will be our castle." I laughed, told her castles don't come with leaky roofs and raccoons in the shed. She said, "Then we'll build our own kind of kingdom." And we did. Week by week, brick by brick, plank by plank. I'd work on the frame while she painted the windowsills. At night, we'd eat canned soup on the floor, her head resting on my shoulder. Our first Christmas there, the house was barely finished. No insulation, one working heater. She hung a single string of lights, and I carved a wooden star for the top of the tree. That was enough. As long as we have warmth and work, she said, we're rich enough. Then Daniel came along, a winter baby with lungs strong enough to wake the neighbors. He grew fast, always curious. By the time he was 7, he could hammer a nail straighter than most adults. I remember the summer he begged me to teach him how to build something real. So we built a birdhouse together. He painted it bright blue, called it Sky Home. He used to show it off to everyone who visited. My dad made this, he'd say, chest out, eyes full of pride. Those were the days I thought love was simple. You give everything, and it stays. One Christmas when he was 9, he gave me a small box wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a coin, just a regular nickel, but he'd covered it in aluminum foil and written on it in pencil. To Dad, my hero. I laughed until I cried. That coin's still in my drawer, dull now, but heavier than gold. I thought those words would carry us through anything. But years have a way of sanding down what you thought was unbreakable. When Daniel turned 18, he left for college. I still remember the way Maria held onto his jacket like she could keep him from walking out the door. We waved until his car disappeared down the road. She cried that night, but not because she was sad. She said it was the price of raising someone strong enough to leave. The years after that blurred together work bills, late nights. Then Maria got sick. Cancer, the kind that takes pieces of a person slowly. I kept working during the day and sat by her bedside at night. Sometimes Daniel called, sometimes he didn't. He was building a career, a life. Maria never blamed him. She said, "He's good inside, Robert. Don't let money change what you built." When she passed, the house felt too big for one man. I kept her favorite blanket on the couch, the one with the stitched snowflakes. Every Christmas I'd unfold it just to feel like she was still near. Tonight, I took out that same coin Daniel gave me decades ago. The foils torn, the pencil marks faded. I held it under the lamp, tracing the faint word, hero. Funny thing, heroes don't feel like heroes when they're sitting alone. Maria used to tell me promises are like houses, they need maintenance, or they fall apart. I promised her I'd keep this family together, that I'd always make sure Daniel had what he needed. I kept that promise. But maybe keeping it cost me everything else. Before going to bed, I placed the coin back in its box and set it on the table beside the ledger. 2 relics from 2 different lives, one built on love, the other on debt. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing every footprint on the path. I wondered if forgiveness worked the same way, covering, but never truly clearing. The first week after Christmas passed quietly, or so I thought. I spent my mornings in the workshop sanding an old rocking chair for Mrs. Donovan next door, trying to lose myself in the sound of wood against paper. Silence is gentler when you fill it with small tasks. Then an email came through from the bank. Automatic transfer unsuccessful. For a second, I didn't understand. I hadn't touched that account in months. Then it hit me, the standing transfer I'd set up for Daniel's mortgage. Somehow it was still active after all these years. I stared at the numbers. The payment due was enough to buy a small truck. I sat back, rubbed my temples, and whispered, "Enough, Robert." It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion that sounded like wisdom. That afternoon, I walked to the bank, canceled the automatic transfer, and felt lighter walking out than I had in months. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. The next morning, the phone rang. Robert Victoria's voice smooth as ice. "We need a favor. My parents are flying in tomorrow. Daniel's tied up at work. Could you pick them up from the airport?" "I can't, Victoria. I've got a few commitments here." A pause. Then that cutting tone she used when she wanted to remind you who had the power. "You've changed, Robert." I thought family helps family. "Family," I repeated. That word used to mean something. She hung up without another word. I told myself it didn't matter that maybe she'd cool down, but when a Carter loses face, they don't forgive, they retaliate. 3 days later, I learned what retaliation looked like in print. Mrs. Donovan knocked on my door with her phone trembling in her hand. "Robert." She said, "You'd better see this." It was a headline from the Portland Chronicle. Spokane businessman abandons elderly couple at airport during snowstorm. Below it was my name, my photo. They'd taken it from Facebook, a picture of me at Daniel's wedding, smiling under the fairy lights. The caption read, "Local retiree fails to assist in-laws, prompting community outrage." I scrolled, reading line after line that felt like being skinned alive. It said I'd promised to drive to the airport, that I'd forgotten that Mr. and Mrs. Carter had been left waiting in freezing conditions for 3 hours. None of it was true. The comment section was worse. How can people like that sleep at night? Somebody should take his workshop license away, heartless old miser. I could almost hear Maria's voice telling me to breathe. I tried, but breathing hurt. I called Daniel. The line clicked then, his voice small rushed. "Dad, I know about the article. It's complicated." "Complicated," I said. "They're lying, Daniel. I know, but Victoria's parents look just... Stay calm. Okay, it'll blow over. Blow over. My name's on fire. Dad, please," he whispered. "Just don't make it worse." He hung up before I could answer. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the article on my laptop screen. I refreshed the page again and again as if the truth might appear if I looked hard enough. Instead, I watched the number of shares climb hundreds, then thousands. By morning, people I hadn't spoken to in years stopped answering my calls. Clients canceled repair jobs. A kid spray-painted heartless on my fence. I'd always believed if you did right by others, the world would even the scales eventually. Turns out the world doesn't own a level. For 2 days I kept quiet. But silence, I realized, was just permission in disguise. So I started digging. I traced the article's byline, Ellen Foster. I remembered the name. She'd covered social features for the Chronicle, often writing about the Carter family's charity events. A coincidence too sharp to ignore. The next morning, I took a bus to Portland, the same city that had once felt like a second home. I walked straight into the Chronicle office and asked for her. She appeared behind the glass wall, mid-30s, polished the kind of confidence that feeds on other people's stories. "I'm here about your article," I said. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Everything printed was verified by sources close to the family. "Sources who lie for Christmas entertainment," I replied. Security asked me to leave. I did, but not before I looked her in the eye and said, "When the truth comes out, make sure you print it the same size." I rode the evening bus back to Spokane, the city lights dissolving behind the fogged window. The newspaper still trembled in my hands, the headline screaming louder than any courtroom. I wanted to tear it to pieces, but part of me knew this was evidence now. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel as a boy, holding that blue birdhouse, proud and certain of who I was. Now the whole world thought I'd abandoned an old couple in the snow. By morning, I turned my anger into order. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled every receipt, every record I'd kept over the years. Maria used to tease me for saving too much paper. Maybe she was still looking out for me. Mortgage statements, wire confirmations, bank transfers labeled Carter residence Daniel Hayes, 5 years worth of proof that I'd carried that family's roof on my back. I spread them across the table like cards before a game I never asked to play. Then I opened my laptop, screenshots of Victoria's social posts, photos of designer handbags, a new SUV, their anniversary trip to Maui last summer. All dated within the same week my transfers went through. For each image, I printed the date and attached it to the matching statement. The rhythm of the printer calmed me. Truth had a sound steady and mechanical. When I finished, the table was covered edge to edge with paper, my life documented. I whispered, "You wanted proof, Maria. Here it is." 2 days later, I called Daniel again. He didn't pick up. I left a message anyway. "Son, I'm not asking for apology, just honesty. You know where the money came from. You know what's true. Don't let them rewrite me while I'm still alive." No reply. That evening, I took a short walk to clear my head. The sky was purple with dusk snow crunching beneath my boots. Across the street, a teenager pointed at me, whispering to his friend. I caught a single word, abandoner. It hit harder than I expected. Reputation dies faster than love. So I wrote a letter to the editor, polite, precise, attached scanned documents, sent it certified mail, then waited. A week passed. Nothing. Instead, another article appeared, local craftsman attempts to justify cruel behavior. The piece called me defensive, delusional, and possibly unstable. That was the moment I realized silence wasn't noble. It was surrender. They called him bitter. But what if the truth just hadn't spoken yet? I needed help. Someone who still believed evidence meant something. That's when I remembered Clara Nguyen. She'd been my apprentice years ago, fresh out of trade school before she left carpentry for law. She once said I'd taught her that a clean line tells its own story. Maybe she still believed that. I found her office downtown. The brass sign read, Nguyen and Associates, Property and Civil Law. She looked different, shorter hair, sharper suit, but her eyes still had the same steadiness. "Mr. Hayes," she said, standing. "It's been years. Too many," I answered, "and now I'm in a mess of my own making." I told her everything from the mortgage to the article to Daniel's silence. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she leaned back, hands clasped. "This isn't about money, is it?" "No," I said. "It's about dignity." She nodded slowly. "Good. Because dignity makes juries listen." We spent hours sorting through my pile of papers. She highlighted transfer numbers, circled Victoria's purchases, organized everything into labeled folders. Watching her work reminded me of building furniture, measured twice, cut once. When we were done, she closed the last folder and said, "You could sue them for defamation. I don't want their money." "Then what do you want?" I looked at the folder marked Mortgage, 2019 through 2024. The truth out loud. Clara smiled faintly. "Then we let them speak first. People who lie eventually echo louder than the ones they silence." I liked that. Echoes. Weeks turned into months. The scandal cooled, but my name stayed bruised. A few neighbors started talking to me again, mostly out of curiosity. Every conversation began the same way. Did it really happen? One afternoon, as I was fixing a fence post, a delivery truck pulled up. The driver handed me an envelope. Summons. Small Claims Court. Inside, Victoria Carter was suing me for emotional distress. I laughed so hard I scared the pigeons off the roof. She was suing me for her own lie. I called Clara. She met me that evening at a diner off Main Street. "She's overreaching?" Clara said, stirring her coffee. "But this gives us a stage. A stage. Court records are public. You want the truth out loud?" "This is your microphone." She was right. Sometimes justice doesn't need permission. It just needs daylight. The hearing wasn't scheduled until December 20th, almost exactly 1 year since that phone call. I took it as a sign. During those months, I prepared the same way I used to prepare a blueprint, carefully, patiently, knowing one wrong angle could collapse the whole frame. I cataloged every payment, timestamped every post. I even printed an email Daniel once sent thanking me for helping with the mortgage again. Still, the part that hurt most wasn't what they wrote. It was the silence from my own son. Some nights I'd draft letters I never sent. "Daniel, you don't have to choose sides. Just remember who built your side to stand on." But every time I reread the words, they sounded like pleading, and I'd tear them up. Clara called weakly. "You holding up?" "I'm fine," I lied. "Keep your head," she said. "You'll get your day." When December came again, the town glittered with the same lights as the year before. Except this time, I wasn't outside looking in, I was inside preparing my own storm. On Christmas Eve, I loaded the folders into a leather briefcase, each one labeled in Clara's handwriting: payments, verified photos, luxury spending statements, admissions. I ironed my only suit, the gray one Maria had bought me for Daniel's graduation. She'd said, "You look like a man people should listen to." I hope she was right. The morning of the hearing, I stood before the mirror. The face looking back at me was older, harder, but steadier. "They took my kindness for silence," I told the reflection. "They'll hear me now." The courthouse in Portland sat on a hill, old stone and new glass stitched together like a scar. When I walked through the doors, the marble floor echoed under my boots louder than I expected, as if the building wanted to remember every step. Clara met me inside her briefcase tucked under one arm. "Breathe," she whispered. "We're not here to win hearts. We're here to show facts. I built half my life on facts I said, but people believe stories." She smiled. "Then we tell the right one." The Carters arrived first. Victoria in a red coat, her parents in matching scarves, Daniel behind them like a shadow. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I thought I'd be angry, but I wasn't. I was tired of being the only one who remembered what love used to feel like. When the judge entered, everyone stood. I'd been in courtrooms before, once years ago for a building permit dispute, but this was different. The air hummed with tension, heavy and human. Victoria's lawyer spoke first, spinning words like silk. "Our client suffered emotional trauma due to Mr. Hayes's callous neglect." I sat still, hands folded, listening as they painted me as a man who'd used money to manipulate and withheld compassion as punishment. Each sentence felt like watching someone draw horns on your portrait. When Clara stood, the tone shifted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Your Honor," she began, "my client has given more than most men ever could financially, emotionally, and quietly. Today we present the record of those years. She opened the first folder. Payments verified. Each document stamped, dated, cross-checked. Then photos. Luxury spending. Victoria's smile froze under the courtroom lights, the designer bag gleaming on the projector screen. The murmurs started then. Even the judge adjusted his glasses. Daniel fidgeted, jaw tightening. And finally, statements, admissions. Clara read aloud the email from Daniel. Thanks again for helping with the mortgage, Dad. I promise I'll pay you back someday. Victoria shot Daniel a look sharp enough to cut glass. He sank lower in his seat. When Clara finished, she said softly, "The defense rests." For a moment, no one spoke. The judge cleared his throat. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks for closing." But it didn't matter. The air had already changed. Outside, cameras waited, small local news outlets hungry for irony. Clara told me to keep walking, but one reporter stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, any comment on the accusations?" I looked into the lens. "Only this kindness isn't weakness, but it's easy to mistake one for the other." That line made the evening news. Back in Spokane, I became a curiosity again. Some people avoided eye contact. Others nodded like they'd known all along. It didn't bother me anymore. There's a peace in knowing the truth is finally awake, even if it wakes up slow. A few nights later, as I was locking the workshop, headlights flashed outside. A familiar car pulled into the driveway. Daniel's. He stepped out, hands in his pockets, breath fogging the cold air. "Dad," he said, voice low. "I didn't expect you," I replied. He looked older than I remembered, tired in the eyes, thinner around the edges. "Victoria's furious. She says I betrayed her." "Did you?" He hesitated. "Maybe. I gave Clara that email." The world seemed to pause. "You did the right thing. I should have done it sooner," he whispered. "I just didn't know how to stand between you and her." "Then don't stand between," I said. "Stand for what's right, even if it's not for me." He nodded, tears balancing in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I wanted to say I forgave him, but forgiveness isn't a sentence. It's a slow rebuild, like sanding splinters from old wood." So I only said, "Drive safe, son." He lingered as if waiting for me to invite him in. I didn't, not yet. Some doors need time before they open again. When his taillights disappeared, I went back inside. The house felt quiet, but not empty this time. Maria's blanket lay folded on the couch, and the lamp beside it glowed steady warm. I sat down, staring at the folders on the table. Tomorrow, the papers would go back to Clara for the final filing. Evidence, order, justice, all tidy, but none of it would bring back what was lost. I thought of Maria's last words. "Don't let them make you small." I smiled faintly. I didn't love. Not this time. Outside, the first flakes of snow drifted past the window, landing softly on the old birdhouse Daniel and I had built so many years ago. It hung crooked now, weather-worn, but still standing. "They took my kindness for silence," I murmured. "They'll hear me now." That night I couldn't sleep. The house smelled faintly of sawdust again. I'd been working late without realizing it. The radio played softly, some old carol from the 50s. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't make me sad. It just sounded honest. Outside, snow covered everything, the street, the porch, even the stain on the fence where someone once wrote, "Heartless." The word was gone now, buried under white. Maybe that was enough. Tomorrow would bring lawyers' hearings and noise. But tonight there was peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop explaining yourself to people who never wanted to listen. The snow outside had stopped falling, but the world still felt quiet, like it was holding its breath. I came home from Portland 2 days after the hearing, too tired to feel anything. The neighbors waved when I pulled into the driveway. Not pity, something softer, something closer to respect. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and varnish. I hadn't lit the fireplace in months, but tonight it felt right. The flame caught slowly, a small orange pulse inside the black iron grate. I sat in Maria's chair and waited for the room to warm. On the mantel, the old photos leaned slightly forward, as if they too were trying to listen. Maria in her wedding dress, Daniel as a boy with sawdust in his hair. I used to think a house was just walls and wood. Now it felt more like a witness, quiet patient keeping its own record of who we were before things cracked. I thought about what Clara had said after the hearing: dignity makes juries listen. She was right. But dignity also makes nights longer. It doesn't fill the silence after everyone stops talking. I poured myself a drink, the cheap kind Maria used to call winter medicine, and stared into the fire. The flames moved the way memory does, flickering between what's gone and what refuses to leave. For the first time in years, I spoke to her out loud. You'd laugh if you saw all this, Maria. Me in a courtroom, me learning about hashtags and online lies. The crackle of the fire answered for her. I kept your promise, I said. I didn't let them make me small, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on a mountain you climbed alone. That night, I dreamed of the workshop the way it used to be, sunlight through the window, the sound of Daniel's laughter as he dropped nails all over the floor. In the dream, Maria was there too, brushing sawdust off my shoulders. She said, "Don't let justice harden you, love. The world needs more builders, not more fighters." When I woke, my hands were clenched, palms aching. I opened them slowly, realizing I'd been holding on to nothing at all. I made coffee and watched dawn crawl across the snow. Light touched the birdhouse Daniel and I built, still hanging, still crooked. A small sparrow landed on it, shook off the snow, and peered inside. For a second, I almost laughed. Life was stubborn that way. It kept showing up even where you thought it shouldn't. Maybe forgiveness worked the same. I'd spent months fighting lies, but the truth wasn't something you won. It was something you stood beside quietly until the noise faded. I walked to the drawer, pulled out the old coin Daniel had given me when he was 9. To Dad, my hero. The pencil marks were nearly gone, but when I tilted it toward the window, the word hero caught the morning light. I whispered, "You were just a kid. You didn't know how hard it is to stay one." For a moment, I wondered if Daniel still remembered giving it to me, or if that memory had been buried under all the noise, the money, the pretense. I hope not. Some things deserve to survive us. The phone rang mid-morning. "Clara, the judge ruled in our favor," she said. "The paper will issue a retraction." "It's done, Robert." "Done," I repeated. The word didn't sound like relief. It sounded like an empty room after guests leave. She hesitated. "You okay?" "I'm still here," I said. "That's something." After she hung up, I stood by the window again. The sky had turned the color of pewter. The fence, once spray-painted heartless, was clean now, blank and quiet. Maybe the snow had done what people couldn't, covered the ugliness without asking questions. I thought about calling Daniel. I even picked up the phone. But what would I say? "You did right. I forgive you." The words felt too easy for something that took a lifetime to learn. Instead, I put the phone down and went outside. The cold bit my face, but it felt honest. I walked across the yard, boots crunching in the snow, and stopped beneath the birdhouse. The little sparrow was gone. Inside, only a few feathers remained, proof it had been there, even if only for a moment. I brushed the snow off the roof, straightened it slightly, and whispered, "Still standing, huh? Just like your maker." The wind picked up, scattering flakes like ash. Maybe forgiveness isn't a gift you give them. Maybe it's what keeps you from turning into them. I turned back toward the house, its windows glowing faintly gold against the gray. For once, it didn't look empty. It looked patient, waiting. If you've ever stood between pride and peace, you know one of them always costs more. The next afternoon, I took a walk down to the frozen lake at the edge of town. The path was empty except for a boy sliding a stick across the ice, pretending it was a ship. He looked up and waved. "Mr. Hayes." "My mom says you build things," he called. Sometimes, I said, smiling. "Mostly I just fix what's broken." He grinned. "That's still building, right?" I didn't answer right away. The wind carried the sound of his laughter over the ice, and for a moment I saw Daniel at that age, mud on his knees, pride in his eyes, handing me the crooked birdhouse we made together. When the boy's mother called him home, he ran off, leaving small footprints that disappeared almost as soon as he made them. I stood there watching the ice darken beneath the late sun, the world folding itself into evening. Maybe that was what life did. It erased, softened, replaced, but never truly forgot. I picked up a piece of driftwood from the shore, smooth from time and water, and slipped it into my coat pocket. One day, I whispered, "I'll turn this into something new." And for the first time in years, I meant it. A year is a strange thing. It passes slowly when you wait for forgiveness, and too fast when you're afraid of getting it. Winter came again. The paper had long printed its apology, the neighbors had stopped whispering, and the snow in Spokane had returned to its steady rhythm. Life somehow had forgiven me before my own son did. Then one morning I opened the mailbox and found an envelope with Daniel's handwriting. Inside was a simple card, cream-colored with gold lettering, Christmas dinner, Portland, 6 p.m. Below it in his handwriting, 4 words I hadn't seen in years. Please come home, Dad. For a while I just sat there staring at it. The word home didn't sting like it used to. It sounded like a place that might finally let me in again. I decided to go. That afternoon I polished my shoes, pressed the old gray suit Maria had once called my gentleman armor, and packed 2 small things: the silver-wrapped coin Daniel had given me when he was 9 and the letter I'd written to Maria weeks earlier. Both were reminders of the life I'd built, the one that had survived even after everything else collapsed. The drive to Portland felt longer than before. The roads were lined with frost, the world washed in white. On the radio, Silent Night played softly, and for the first time it didn't make me ache. It just sounded like memory. Halfway there, I caught myself speaking to the empty seat beside me. "You'd like this, Maria," I said. "The world looks clean again." When I arrived, the house was glowing with gold lights, every window spilling laughter into the snow. I parked across the street and watched for a moment, remembering the night I'd once sat there unwelcome holding a turkey that no one wanted. This time I stepped out. I walked to the door, straightened my tie, and rang the bell. Footsteps. Then the door opened and Daniel stood there. Older, paler eyes rimmed red, not from anger but from waiting. "Dad," he said, almost a whisper. "Son." We stood there for a moment, unsure who should move first. Then he stepped aside. "Come in, please." Inside, the house was warm and full of quiet. The laughter I'd heard belonged to the children in the next room. Victoria's nieces and nephews, maybe. Christmas music hummed low from the speakers. Victoria appeared in the doorway wearing a cream dress, her face softer than I remembered. "Hello, Mr. Hayes," she said. No sarcasm, no edge, just a greeting. "Evening," I replied. Daniel gestured toward the dining table. "We were just about to say grace." "I won't stay long," I said. "I only came to give you something." I placed the small box on the table. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was the nickel still wrapped in foil, flattened with time. His eyes widened as if he were 10 again. "I kept it," I said quietly, "all these years, because you once believed in who I was." He swallowed hard, voice trembling. "I don't deserve this. Maybe not. But neither did I deserve what came after. We both made our mistakes." Victoria looked down, her hands clasped tight. I pulled the folded letter from my coat and placed it beside the coin. "This isn't for you," I said. "It's for her. But maybe it'll help you understand." Daniel unfolded it carefully. The ink shimmered faintly under the candlelight. I watched his eyes move across the words, the parts about dignity, forgiveness, and how silence can be louder than love. When he reached the end, his lips pressed into a thin line and tears welled. He looked up at me. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know." He stepped closer. "I don't know how to fix it." "You don't," I said. "You just live better after it." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of carolers drifted faintly through the window. The clock ticked in rhythm with our breathing. Then, Victoria did something I didn't expect. She walked over, touched Daniel's shoulder, and whispered, "Let him stay." Daniel nodded. "Please, Dad. Dinner's almost ready." I hesitated. The room glowed golden and calm, like nothing bad had ever happened here. For a moment I imagined sitting down, carving the turkey, pretending time could be rewound. But some things shouldn't be rushed, not even healing. I smiled faintly. "Not tonight. But thank you." Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just nodded. I put a hand on his shoulder. "The truth doesn't need applause," I said softly. "It just needs to be seen." Then I turned toward the door. Behind me I heard his voice, quiet, steady. "Merry Christmas, Dad." I paused, hand on the doorknob. The same words I'd waited a lifetime to hear, simple and human. "Merry Christmas, son." Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and slow. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the cold air, watching the light spill through the windows. The house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like the beginning of something unfinished, but good. As I walked back to the car, I looked up at the stars breaking through the clouds. Somewhere I imagined Maria watching her smile, warm as ever, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel small. I didn't drive home right away. The road out of Portland was clear, the snow falling in slow ribbons that the headlights turned to silver. The silence in the car felt kind, not empty, just quiet in a way that finally made sense. Halfway to Spokane, I stopped at a small diner that hadn't changed since the 80s. The waitress, gray-haired and kind-eyed, poured coffee without asking. "Traveling for the holidays," she said. "Heading home," I answered. The word felt truer than it had in years. As she walked away, I noticed a folded newspaper beside the sugar jar. On the front page was a photo from that night, the Carter family Christmas. The headline read, "A year after scandal, a family finds its way back." There, near the edge of the photo, barely in frame, was me standing outside the house, a faint reflection in the window glass. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. I smiled. It was perfect. The world didn't need to see me clearly. It just needed to know I was still there. I finished my coffee, left a tip, and stepped back into the cold. The wind carried faint music from a nearby church. "O Holy Night," sung off-key but honest. Before getting into the car, I looked up at the sky again. Snowflakes caught in my hair, melted, vanished. Somewhere in that soft, white silence, I heard Maria's voice, gentle, amused. "You did good, Robert. You stayed kind." I whispered back, "You too." Then I started the engine, headlights cutting through the snow, the road stretching wide and open. For the first time in a long while, I didn't need to know where it ended. Because sometimes peace doesn't look like winning. It just looks like not fighting anymore. Voices fade. But guilt echoes louder. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller until it was just a cluster of lights flickering like a constellation built from forgiveness. For a second, I almost turned back just to see it once more, but some goodbyes work better unspoken. The road curved toward the mountains, and the snow deepened, blanketing everything in the same calm white that had covered my fence a year ago. The world, I realized, had a way of erasing pain without asking permission. I rolled down the window, let the cold air rush in, and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Maria." The wind carried it away, soft but still echoing. If this story touched you, don't let it fade with the snow. Some truths deserve to be heard again and shared. Subscribe to Echoes of Betrayal for more stories where silence speaks louder than revenge, and where love still finds its way home. Because in every family, forgiveness has a sound, and it never truly stops echoing. Thank you for watching.